Good evening. Arthur Hastings here, welcoming you once more to The Little Grey Cells. Tonight's tale: The Locked Drawing Room, a Hercule Poirot mystery that proves, as my dear friend would say, that the most impossible crimes often have the simplest solutions. Before we begin, I must convey Poirot's own appreciation, and mine, to our extraordinary audience spanning continents and time zones. New listeners, we would be most honoured if you'd subscribe and share with us your location in the comments below. And do tell us, have you ever encountered a locked room mystery, in fiction or in life, that seemed utterly impossible until the method was revealed? Now then, settle into your chair, brew a proper tisane, as the great detective would insist, and join me at Thornfield Manor this cold December evening. A snowbound country house. A cruel man found dead behind a door locked from within, and a secret that poison and love conspired to conceal. Your grey cells are about to be put to work. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The picture frame hung at an angle of perhaps 3 degrees from the vertical. It was, Hercule Poirot reflected as he stood before it, with his head tilted in precise counter-inclination, a very small thing. And yet it was not right. It was not as it should be. He reached up with both hands, adjusted the frame with the delicacy of a surgeon, then stepped back to survey his work. Better. He moved the frame a fraction of an inch to the left, stepped back again, tilted his egg-shaped head to one side, then the other. Voila. Order was restored. The bedroom assigned to him at Thornfield Manor was adequate, though the wallpaper displayed a pattern of climbing roses that repeated with neither symmetry nor sense. His small valise lay open upon the bed, and he returned to it now, removing each item and placing it upon the dresser with geometric precision. Collar studs here, cufflinks there aligned north to south. His clothes brush exactly parallel to the edge. A man, Poirot had long ago concluded, must impose order upon his environment or risk disorder imposing itself upon his mind. He paused, his hand resting upon a carefully folded silk handkerchief, and considered the letter that had brought him to this Tudor manor house in the depths of Berkshire 4 days before Christmas. The invitation had been cordial. Lady Celia Thornfield, whom he had encountered the previous summer at Deauville, had written in a graceful hand, "Do come. Ah, Monsieur Poirot. You will find us all terribly ordinary, but perhaps that is what I need just now. Someone who sees what others overlook." It was the final phrase that had arrested his attention. Someone who sees what others overlook, not someone who is amusing, not someone who tells diverting stories, but someone who sees. Lady Celia, he suspected, wished him to see something. Whether she would tell him what remained to be discovered. He finished his unpacking, adjusted his tie in the mirror until it achieved perfection, and descended the dark oak staircase to the drawing room where tea was being served. The room into which he was shown bore all the marks of Tudor solidity, softened by Victorian excess. Dark wood panels climbed to the ceiling, where elaborate plasterwork created patterns that made Poirot's eye twitch with their asymmetry. Mullioned windows looked out upon gardens that lay dormant under December frost. A fire burned in the vast stone fireplace, yet the room somehow remained cold, as though the chill had settled into the very walls over centuries and would not be dislodged by mere flame. Lady Celia rose to greet him. She was 32, beautiful in that particularly English way that suggested careful maintenance rather than natural bloom. Pearls encircled her throat, large, lustrous things that seemed almost too heavy for her neck. Her smile was warm, but Poirot, who noticed such things, observed that it did not quite reach her eyes. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, how good of you to come. Let me introduce you to everyone." As she performed the introductions with the ease of a woman accustomed to managing social occasions, though her hands, Poirot noted, were never quite still. Sir Edmund Thornfield stood before the fire, master of all he surveyed. He was 60, spare and upright, with the bearing of a man who had never in his life been contradicted with impunity. His handshake was brief and cold. "So you are Celia's Belgian detective. I hope you will not find us too dull a subject for observation." The words were courteous. The tone was not. Poirot inclined his head and murmured something polite. Sir Edmund's eyes, he observed, were the colour of winter sky and held about as much warmth. Beside the tea-table sat Miss Beatrice Thornfield, Sir Edmund's unmarried sister. She was 58 and dressed in unrelieved grey, whereas though she had appointed herself chief mourner at a funeral that had not yet occurred. Her eyes were sharp as pins. "I trust you will not find our little Christmas gathering too provincial for your continental tastes, Monsieur Poirot." The words could have been pleasant, were not. Poirot assured her that he found all aspects of English life quite fascinating. Miss Beatrice's expression suggested she found this answer inadequate. The young man lounging in the window seat rose with languid grace. James Ashworth was 35, possessed of the kind of careless good looks that open doors and empty wallets. He was Sir Edmund's nephew, Celia explained, son of his late brother. "Delighted to meet you, Monsieur Poirot. Aunt Celia's told us all about you. Track down murderers and all that. Must be frightfully interesting." His handshake was warm, his smile engaging. Poirot, who had met many charming men and found half of them to be scoundrels, reserved judgment. Dr. Marcus Faversham stood near the bookcase, teacup balanced on knee. He was 52, urbane and reassuring in the manner of successful physicians. His greeting was professional but cordial. "Hercule Poirot. Yes, I've read of your cases in the newspapers. Welcome to Thornfield." Poirot noticed, because he noticed everything, that Dr. Faversham had poured Lady Celia's tea before she asked for it, had known, without being told, that she took it with milk and no sugar. The gesture spoke of long familiarity. In the corner, nearly invisible in her quietness, sat Mrs. Dorothea Vale. She was 45, dressed in a dark dress that had been fashionable perhaps a decade earlier. Her role, as Celia explained, was companion to Miss Beatrice. Mrs. Vale smiled nervously when introduced, then looked away, but not before Poirot had glimpsed something in her eyes that might have been fear. Tea proceeded with the stately awkwardness of English social ritual. Conversation touched upon the weather. It had been cold, the condition of the roads. They were tolerable, and the prospects for Christmas, they would be having a goose. Poirot contributed little, content to observe. He observed that Sir Edmund addressed his wife with courtesy, but no affection. That James Ashworth was attentive to Lady Celia in a manner that made Sir Edmund's jaw tighten. That Miss Beatrice watched her sister-in-law as one might watch a specimen under glass. That Dr. Faversham's eyes followed Celia whenever she moved, and that Mrs. Vale saw it all, and said nothing. After tea, Poirot excused himself to examine the library. It was a handsome room, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. He had just discovered a first edition of Boswell when voices in the corridor arrested his attention. Lady Celia and Sir Edmund. Their voices were low, but intensity carried them through the partly open door. "I simply cannot go on like this, Edmund." "Then perhaps you should have considered that before—" The sentence dropped to inaudibility. "You cannot hold it over me forever. It was before I even met you. Can I not? We shall see." Footsteps retreated. Poirot remained motionless behind the wing chair that had partially concealed him. Moments later, Lady Celia entered the library. She did not see him. She walked to the window and stood there, looking out at nothing, her reflection pale in the darkening glass. She raised both hands to her temples and pressed, as though trying to contain some inward pressure. Then, so quietly that Poirot barely heard it, she whispered, "God help me, what have I done?" She turned and left, as silently as she had come. Poirot remained where he was, his fingers steepled before his lips. So, the ordinary household concealed something not ordinary at all. Lady Celia had invited him for a purpose. He began to suspect what that purpose might be. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in the panelled dining room. The meal was excellent, the conversation stilted. It was toward the end of the final course that Sir Edmund cleared his throat. "I shall be working in the drawing-room after dinner. I have correspondence to attend to, and I will not be interrupted by anyone. The door will be locked. You will all respect that." The announcement fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. For a moment, no one spoke. Miss Beatrice said dryly, "How very dramatic, Edmund." He ignored her. His eyes moved around the table with slow deliberation. Celia, James, Dr. Faversham, Mrs. Vale, his sister. It was the look of a man who knew something and wished everyone to know that he knew it. When dinner concluded, Sir Edmund rose without a word and left the room. The company listened to his footsteps recede down the east corridor. Then came the sound, sharp and final in the silence, of a key turning in a lock. Poirot, finding himself restless, walked the grounds before retiring. The December air was knife-sharp, the gardens ghostly under a thin moon. When he returned at 10 o'clock, he passed the drawing-room door. A line of light showed beneath it. All was silent. He climbed the stairs to bed, but sleep eluded him. Something in the house felt wrong, like the crooked picture frame. Something was not as it should be. He did not yet know what, but he would discover it. Of that, Hercule Poirot was entirely certain. Chapter 2. The Night Watch. The company dispersed after dinner like guests fleeing a house already haunted. Lady Celia murmured something about a headache and retired early. James Ashworth disappeared in the direction of the billiard room, a decanter tucked under his arm with the casualness of long practice. Miss Beatrice and Mrs. Vale withdrew to the former's sitting room where, Poirot suspected, they would spend the evening in that peculiar silence that passes for companionship among the unhappy. And only Dr. Faversham lingered in the hall, ostensibly examining a painting of some long-dead Thornfield ancestor. Poirot, descending from his constitutional walk, found the physicians still there at 10:30. "You admire the portrait, Doctor?" Faversham started slightly. "I was thinking, actually." Edmund's announcement at dinner was unusual, even for him. He enjoys his dramatic gestures, but this felt different, more pointed. Poirot regarded him with interest. "You have known Sir Edmund for many years, I understand. 20, give or take. I attended his first wife during her final illness. He has always been a difficult man, but lately—" He stopped, as though aware he had ventured too far into confidence with a stranger. "But lately," Poirot prompted gently. Dr. Faversham chose his words with care. "Lately he has seemed preoccupied, or suspicious even, as though he believed himself surrounded by enemies rather than family. And is he? Surrounded by enemies?" The doctor's smile was thin. "That, Monsieur Poirot, is a philosophical question. Edmund has spent his life believing that control and suspicion are forms of wisdom. Whether that belief has created the very situation he fears, I could not say." He bid Poirot good night and departed, leaving the detective alone in the dim hallway. Poirot stood motionless, his grey cells arranging and rearranging the pieces of the puzzle before him. A household in discord. A husband who blackmailed his wife with some unnamed secret. A nephew who owed money. A physician whose eyes followed Lady Celia with more than professional concern. A sister who watched everything with grim disapproval. A companion who seemed frightened of her own shadow. And at the centre, Sir Edmund, locked in his drawing room with his correspondence and his secrets. Poirot walked slowly past the drawing-room door. The line of light beneath it had not diminished. He paused, listening. Nothing. The silence was absolute. He continued to the staircase and was halfway up when a figure emerged from the shadows of the landing. Mrs. Dorothea Vale stood there, her hands twisted together. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forgive me. I wondered if I might speak with you. In private. But of course, madame. Shall we— not here?" Her eyes darted toward the corridor below. "Tomorrow, perhaps, if you walk in the gardens after breakfast. I will find you there." Before he could respond, she had vanished back into the darkness, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her apparent timidity. "Most interesting," Poirot murmured to himself. He continued to his room, but before preparing for bed, he returned to the window and looked out across the grounds. The gardens lay in darkness, but the east wing was visible from this angle. He counted windows until he found the one that must belong to the drawing room. Light glowed behind the curtains. As he watched, a shadow passed across them. Sir Edmund, still at his correspondence at this late hour, or perhaps not correspondence at all. Perhaps the letter to his solicitor was merely pretext for something else. But what? Poirot remained at the window for some time, but the shadow did not appear again. He woke at 7 the following morning, that curious half-waking that comes when one sleeps in an unfamiliar house, or for a moment he lay still, listening to Thornfield Manor come to life. Footsteps in distant corridors, the clatter of coal being delivered to grates, a door closing somewhere below. Then, cutting through these ordinary sounds, came something else. Voices raised in urgency. Rapid footsteps. A knock, sharp and insistent, followed by another. Poirot rose, dressed with his customary precision despite the evident crisis unfolding below, and descended to find the household in a state of controlled chaos. The scene was this. Miss Beatrice stood before the drawing-room door, her grey dress perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Beside her, a young housemaid twisted her apron in evident distress. Lady Celia hovered at the edge of the group, still in her dressing gown, her face pale. James Ashworth was there as well, all looking dishevelled and uncertain. "He does not answer," Miss Beatrice said to no one in particular. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, clenching and unclenching at her sides. "Perhaps he has fallen asleep in his chair," James suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "He was working late. One does sometimes." Edmund has never in his life fallen asleep in a chair. Miss Beatrice's tone could have etched glass, and he is always punctual for breakfast. Always. Dr. Faversham arrived at that moment, summoned from his own room by the commotion. What has happened? Sir Edmund does not respond to knocking, Poirot said quietly. And the door, it remains locked. Faversham moved to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. After a long moment he straightened. I hear nothing. No movement, no sound of breathing. A cold understanding seemed to settle over the group. We must break it down, James said. There's no other way. If he's ill... No. Lady Celia's voice was sharp. No, wait. Perhaps there is another key. Edmund might have... There is no other key, Miss Beatrice interrupted. Edmund kept the only key to this room on his personal ring. He was most particular about it. She looked at her sister-in-law with an expression Poirot could not quite read. Almost, he thought, as though she suspected Celia of knowing more than she admitted. Then we have no choice, Dr. Faversham said. He turned to James. Help me. We'll need something to force the lock. No, Poirot said sharply. All eyes turned to him. Before we break anything, permit me to examine, if you please. He approached the door and knelt with some difficulty, his fastidious nature objecting to the position, but his mind overruling such concerns. He peered through the keyhole. The key, it is in the lock, on the interior side. He straightened, brushing invisible dust from his trousers. This confirms that the door was locked from within. Then Edmund must be in there, James said. But why doesn't he answer? The possibilities, Poirot said softly, are limited, and none of them, I think, are pleasant. Lady Celia made a small sound, quickly stifled. Dr. Faversham and James Ashworth fetched a heavy iron poker from the morning room. The assembled company watched in silence as they positioned themselves on either side of the door. On 3, Faversham said. 1, 2, 3. They threw their combined weight against the wood. The door shuddered but held. Again they tried. And again. On the 4th attempt, the frame splintered with a crack like a gunshot, and the door burst inward. The drawing-room lay before them exactly as Poirot had glimpsed it during tea the previous day, and yet utterly changed. The fire had died to cold ash. The curtains remained drawn against the morning light. And in the wing chair before the fireplace sat Sir Edmund Thornfield. His head tilted back against the leather, his eyes were open, staring at the elaborately plastered ceiling with an expression of mild surprise. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers slightly curled. His left lay in his lap. He was quite obviously dead. Dr. Faversham crossed the room in 3 strides. He placed his fingers against Sir Edmund's neck, then against his wrist. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he straightened. He's gone. Dead for hours, I should think. The body is quite cold. Lady Celia swayed. Mrs. Vale, who had appeared silently during the door breaking, caught her arm and supported her. But how? Miss Beatrice's voice was steady, but her face had gone white. His heart? Faversham did not answer immediately. He was examining the body with professional thoroughness, noting things that Poirot could not see from the doorway. Possibly, he said at last. Edmund had a weak heart, though he refused to acknowledge it. The symptoms are consistent, but I would prefer a post-mortem. There is something... He paused, frowning. Poirot, who had been surveying the room with that peculiar intensity that meant his mind was cataloguing every detail, spoke quietly. Dr. Faversham, you do not sound certain. The doctor met his eyes. I am certain he is dead, Monsieur Poirot. Of what killed him, I am less certain. And with those words, the locked drawing-room mystery began in earnest. Chapter 3. The little grey cells begin their work. Poirot stood in the doorway of the drawing-room and raised one hand in a gesture that was both polite and absolute. I must ask that no one enters further. Not yet. But surely, James Ashworth began, we should— No one, Poirot repeated. His voice was soft, but something in it made James fall silent. Dr. Faversham, you have confirmed that Sir Edmund is deceased. That is sufficient for the moment. Now I must request that you all retire to the morning room. I will join you presently. Miss Beatrice drew herself up. This is my brother's house, Monsieur Poirot. I hardly think it is also, madame, possibly the scene of a crime. And I have some small experience in such matters. He inclined his head with exquisite courtesy. I ask only for a few minutes of observation before anything is disturbed. You will permit this, yes? There was a moment of tense silence. Then Lady Celia spoke, her voice barely audible. Let him look, please. The group filed out reluctantly. Dr. Faversham was the last to leave, pausing at the threshold. You think this was not natural, he said quietly. It was not a question. I think, mon ami, that I do not yet know what to think. And until I do know, I will assume nothing. When they had gone, Poirot stepped into the room with the delicacy of a man entering a church. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, his eyes moving across the space with methodical precision. The drawing-room was large, perhaps 30 feet in length, with windows along the eastern wall. These windows were closed, their latches fastened. The curtains had been drawn the previous evening and remained so. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned itself to ash and gone cold. The room held the particular chill of a space where warmth has fled and death has taken up residence. Poirot began with the door itself. He examined the shattered frame where the lock had been forced, then bent to inspect the key that still protruded from the interior side. A heavy brass key, dulled with age. He touched nothing, merely observed. The door had been locked from within. Of that there could be no doubt. He turned his attention to the room's sole occupant. Sir Edmund Thornfield sat in his wing chair as though he had simply paused in his evening's work and would resume at any moment. But the stillness of the body, the waxy quality of the skin, told a different story. Poirot approached without touching, his eyes noting every detail. The position of the hands, one on the chair arm, one in the lap. The head tilted back, the eyes open, the mouth slightly parted. The expression, if one could call it that, suggested surprise rather than pain. A man who had not expected what had happened to him. The clothing was undisturbed. Evening dress still neat, no sign of struggle, no violence to the person. Poirot's gaze moved to the small table beside the chair. Upon it rested 3 items: an empty brandy glass, a fountain pen, and several sheets of writing paper. He bent close to the brandy glass without touching it. The crystal was of excellent quality, cut in a pattern that caught what little light penetrated the curtained room. At the bottom of the glass, barely visible, was a residue of amber liquid. Poirot inhaled carefully. Brandy, yes, but something else as well. Something that made his eyes narrow. The fountain pen lay precisely parallel to the edge of the table. This small detail pleased the orderly part of Poirot's mind, even as the greater part noted its significance. Sir Edmund had been a man of precision, like himself. The pen's placement was deliberate. He turned his attention to the papers. The top sheet bore Sir Edmund's handwriting, firm and clear. "My dear Carruthers, I write to you on a matter of great importance regarding my will. Recent discoveries have necessitated certain changes, which I shall enumerate when next we meet. I have uncovered—" And there the sentence ended. The pen had been set down mid-word. Poirot straightened, his fingers steepled before his lips. Sir Edmund had been writing to his solicitor about changing his will, about discoveries. But what discoveries? And had he lived long enough to complete the letter, or had death interrupted him? He moved to the mantelpiece. Among the usual clutter of such spaces, an ornamental clock, a pair of porcelain figurines that made Poirot wince at their asymmetrical placement, several calling cards in a silver tray. Nothing appeared disturbed. The clock arrested his attention. It showed 10:30, but when Poirot brought his ear close, he heard nothing. The mechanism had stopped. He pulled out his own watch. It showed 20 minutes past 9 in the morning, and noted the discrepancy. "Dr. Faversham, what time did Sir Edmund retire to this room last evening?" He called the question toward the hall, where he knew the family waited. "Just after dinner," came Miss Beatrice's voice, sharp and clear. 8:30, perhaps. We all heard him lock the door. Poirot nodded to himself. So Sir Edmund had been in this room from 8:30. The clock had stopped at 10:30. 2 hours. Much could happen in 2 hours. He crossed to the sideboard where decanters stood in a neat row. The brandy decanter was nearly full, as one would expect from a bottle recently opened. Poirot lifted it to the light, observing the liquid within. Clear amber, no sediment visible to the naked eye. But appearance, as Hercule Poirot well knew, could deceive. He set down the decanter and moved to the windows. Each one was latched from the inside. He tested them gently. None gave. The windows had not been opened. Outside, the December frost had painted patterns on the glass. The gardens beyond lay empty and silent. A locked room, then, locked from within, with the key in place. Windows secured, no other entrance visible. And yet Sir Edmund Thornfield lay dead in his chair, with an expression of surprise frozen on his face. Poirot returned to stand before the body, his head tilted in thought. He remained thus for perhaps 2 minutes, perfectly still, his grey cells arranging the facts. An empty brandy glass with residue at the bottom. A letter to a solicitor, unfinished, mentioning discoveries and changes to a will. A stopped clock, a locked room, and the faint odour he had detected in the brandy glass, barely perceptible but unmistakable to one who had encountered it before. He walked to the doorway where the others waited in the hall, their faces turned towards him with varying expressions of anxiety and impatience. "You will summon the police, s'il vous plaît," Poirot said quietly. "This is not a natural death." The words fell like stones into water. Lady Celia swayed again. Miss Beatrice's face went rigid. James Ashworth took a step backward. Mrs. Vale made a small sound of distress. Only Dr. Faversham seemed unsurprised, though his face was grave. "You are certain?" the doctor asked. "As certain as I can be without chemical analysis." "But yes, I am certain. Sir Edmund did not die of heart failure, though I suspect that is what the murderer wished us to believe." "Murderer?" Miss Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. "You speak of murder?" "I speak of poison, madame. Administered, I believe, in the brandy which Sir Edmund consumed last evening. The residue in the glass. It has a scent, faint but distinctive to one who knows what to seek. "But that's impossible," James burst out. The door was locked from the inside. No one could have entered or left. How could anyone have poisoned him? "That," Poirot said softly, "is indeed the question. How could anyone have poisoned a man locked in a room with no entrance and no exit? It seems, does it not, an impossibility?" He paused, his eyes moving across their faces. "And yet, mes amis, there is no such thing as an impossible crime. There are only crimes which appear impossible because we do not yet understand the method. Sir Edmund Thornfield was murdered. Of that, I am now convinced. The question is not whether it happened, but how. And, naturellement, by whom?" And the silence that followed was profound. Then Miss Beatrice spoke, her voice cold and clear. "You will forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, but this seems a rather dramatic conclusion to draw from a smell." Poirot turned his gaze upon her. "Perhaps, madame, but I have learned to trust my instincts in such matters, and my instincts tell me that your brother did not die a natural death. He was killed, deliberately, by someone who knew him well enough to gain access to what he would drink, someone who knew his habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities. He let the words settle. Someone, in short, who is almost certainly in this house at this very moment." With that pronouncement, Hercule Poirot turned and re-entered the drawing-room, leaving the assembled company to contemplate the terrible implications of what he had just revealed. Chapter 4. On Questions and Evasions. Inspector Marsh arrived from the village at 10:30, accompanied by a young constable whose notebook appeared larger than his experience. The inspector was a solid man in his middle 50s, with the weather-beaten face of one who had spent his career in rural constabularies dealing with poached pheasants and disputes over boundary walls. Murder was not, Poirot suspected, a frequent visitor to Berkshire. "Belgian detective, eh?" Marsh said, shaking Poirot's hand with the grip of a man testing the weight of a purchase. "Read about you in the papers. That business at Styles. Clever work, that. You're too kind, Inspector. Well, let's see what we have here, then." Marsh's tone suggested he expected nothing more sinister than an old man's heart giving out at an inconvenient hour. Haute Poirot led him to the drawing-room and stood aside while the inspector made his examination. To his credit, Marsh was thorough. He noted the locked door, the latched windows, the position of the body. He bent to sniff the brandy glass, though whether he detected what Poirot had detected remained unclear. "Dr. Faversham says heart failure," Marsh observed, straightening from his inspection. "But you think otherwise. I think the brandy glass tells a story, and the unfinished letter, and the stopped clock. These things, they speak to me." "Speak of what, exactly?" "Of a man interrupted, a man who did not expect what befell him." Poirot gestured to the letter on the table. He was writing to his solicitor about changes to his will, about discoveries. One does not speak of discoveries unless one has uncovered something significant. Marsh read the letter, his expression growing thoughtful. Could be coincidence. Man decides to change his will, works himself into a state. Heart gives out. It could be, yes, but I do not think so. The inspector regarded him for a long moment. "All right, Monsieur Poirot. I'll send the body for post-mortem examination. We'll know soon enough if there's poison in him. In the meantime, I'll want statements from everyone in the house." They assembled the household in the library, where a fire had been hastily lit against the December cold. The company arranged themselves with the unconscious hierarchy of the English drawing room. Miss Beatrice claimed the chair nearest the fire. Lady Celia sat by the window with Mrs. Vale hovering protectively nearby. James Ashworth lounged against the mantelpiece with studied casualness, and Dr. Faversham stood somewhat apart, his medical bag still in hand. Inspector Marsh took the seat behind Sir Edmund's desk, positioning himself with the authority of the law. Poirot remained standing, preferring to observe the faces of those questioned. "Now then," Marsh began, consulting his notebook. "I understand Sir Edmund retired to the drawing-room after dinner last evening. What time was that?" "8:30, Miss Beatrice said crisply. Dinner concluded at 8:20. Edmund announced his intention to work undisturbed and went directly to the drawing-room. We heard him lock the door. And none of you saw him after that?" "None of us," Miss Beatrice confirmed. "The door remained locked throughout the evening." She paused, then added with something that might have been satisfaction. "From the inside." Marsh made a note. What were Sir Edmund's spirits at dinner? Did he seem unwell? Agitated? Lady Celia spoke, her voice small. He seemed purposeful, as though he had made some decision. What sort of decision? She twisted her wedding ring. "I don't know. He did not confide in me." Poirot, watching, saw the glance that passed between Lady Celia and Dr. Faversham. Brief, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A question in her eyes, an answer in his. "Dr. Faversham," Marsh continued, "you've been the family physician for some years. Was Sir Edmund in poor health?" The doctor chose his words carefully. He had a cardiac condition. Mild but present. I had advised him to reduce his stress, avoid excessive spirits, take more rest. He declined to follow any of this advice. So a heart attack would not surprise you? It would not surprise me, no. But Faversham hesitated, and Marsh pounced on the hesitation like a cat on a mouse. But the position of the body troubles me. A man in cardiac distress typically clutches at his chest, shows signs of struggle. Sir Edmund appears to have simply stopped, as though death came quickly and without warning. Which is consistent, Poirot interjected gently, with certain poisons. All eyes turned to him. "What poisons?" Marsh demanded. "There are several that act swiftly and leave little trace. Digitalis, for instance, derived from foxglove. In sufficient quantity, it can mimic heart failure. Or there is aconite, which produces similar symptoms. The scent in the brandy glass suggests—" He stopped, unwilling to commit himself further without confirmation. James Ashworth laughed, though the sound held no humour. "This is absurd. You're saying one of us crept into a locked room, somehow poisoned Uncle Edmund and crept out again, locking the door behind us from the inside? It's impossible." Poirot turned to him. "You find it impossible, monsieur. I find it ludicrous." James's handsome features were flushed. "Look at this room. One door, locked from within. Windows latched. No secret panels or hidden passages. This isn't a Gothic novel. If Uncle Edmund was poisoned, he must have poisoned himself." "An interesting theory," Poirot murmured. "And what would be his motive for such an action? How should I know? Perhaps he discovered he was dying anyway and wished to control the manner of it. Perhaps he—" James stopped, as though realizing he was venturing into dangerous territory. "Perhaps he what?" "Nothing. I'm merely suggesting alternatives to this murder fantasy." Marsh intervened. "Let's focus on facts. Who had access to Sir Edmund's brandy?" Mrs. Vale spoke for the first time. her voice trembling. "The decanters in the drawing room are filled each morning by the butler, Simmons. Anyone in the household could have accessed them during the day." "And the drawing room? It was open during the day?" Poirot asked. "Until Sir Edmund locked himself inside. Yes." "So," Marsh said heavily, "any member of this household could have entered the room during the day and tampered with the brandy?" "Theoretically," Dr. Faversham said. "But to what purpose?" "Edmund did not announce his intention to work in the drawing room until dinner. How would the poisoner know he would drink from that particular decanter on that particular evening?" "An excellent question," Poirot agreed. "Unless the poisoner knew Sir Edmund's habits, knew that he often worked in the drawing room, knew that he always took a brandy when he did so." Miss Beatrice's eyes glittered. "My brother was a creature of habit, Monsieur Poirot. Everyone in this household knew his routines, including his routine of locking the door, including that." Marsh shifted in his chair. "I'll need to know where each of you was between 8:30 and midnight last evening." The alibis came forth with varying degrees of certainty. Miss Beatrice and Mrs. Vale had retired to the former's sitting room and remained there until 10:30, when they went to bed. Mrs. Vale confirmed this, though her hands shook as she spoke. James Ashworth had gone to the billiard room and played alone until 11 o'clock. No one had seen him there. Dr. Faversham had returned to his room to read medical journals. Again, as he alone and unwitnessed. Lady Celia had pleaded a headache and gone to her chamber directly after dinner. Her maid had brought her a tisane at 9 o'clock, but otherwise she had been alone. "So," Marsh said grimly, "none of you have what one might call a solid alibi." The silence that followed was profound. Poirot broke it. "Inspector, there is one person we have not discussed. Where was the butler, Simmons, during this time?" Marsh consulted his notes. Simmons was in the servants' hall with the housekeeper and 2 maids until 10 o'clock. All 3 confirmed this. After that, he made his rounds, checking that doors were locked, fires were safe. He retired at 10:30. "So the servants are accounted for," Poirot mused, "which leaves us with the family. And the family friend." He looked at Dr. Faversham as he said this, and the doctor met his gaze steadily. "I think," Marsh said, rising to his feet, "we'd best wait for the post-mortem results before we go much further. If it confirms poison, we'll proceed accordingly. If it shows natural causes, we'll have troubled everyone for nothing." But Poirot knew, with the certainty that came from experience and instinct, that the post-mortem would confirm what he already suspected. Sir Edmund Thornfield had been murdered, and the murderer sat among them, wearing the mask of grief or shock or innocence, waiting to see if Hercule Poirot's little grey cells would uncover the truth. Chapter 5. The first secrets emerge. The post-mortem results arrived by special messenger the following afternoon. Inspector Marsh read the document twice, his expression growing grimmer with each reading. Harm then handed it to Poirot, without comment. Digitalis, the report confirmed. A massive dose, sufficient to cause cardiac arrest within 30 minutes to 2 hours of ingestion. Death would have come swiftly once the poison reached its full effect, producing symptoms nearly indistinguishable from natural heart failure, save for one detail. The body showed traces of foxglove alkaloids far beyond any therapeutic dose. "So you were right," Marsh said heavily. "Murder it is." Poirot folded the report with precise movements. The question now becomes not whether, but who. And more importantly, how? The locked room, you mean? Precisely. A murderer who can neither enter nor leave the scene of the crime is a murderer who should not exist. Yet Sir Edmund is dead, and the poison did not administer itself. Marsh pulled out his pipe. Hull then seemed to remember where he was and put it away again. I've been a policeman for 30 years, Monsieur Poirot. I've seen men killed for money, for love, for revenge. But I've never seen a man killed in a room locked from the inside with no possible means of access. Then we must expand our thinking, Inspector. The impossible, when it occurs, simply means we have not yet understood the possible. The household, informed of the post-mortem results, reacted with the peculiar mix of shock and vindication that accompanies confirmed suspicion. Miss Beatrice withdrew to her sitting room, her grey face even greyer. James Ashworth demanded to know what steps would be taken to find the culprit. Lady Celia said nothing at all, merely sat by the window twisting her wedding ring, round and round and round. Poirot requested permission to conduct private interviews in the library. Marsh, recognizing expertise when he encountered it, agreed readily. The first to be summoned was James Ashworth. The young man entered with the air of one preparing for battle. He took the chair Poirot indicated and immediately lit a cigarette, though no ashtray had been offered. "You wish to speak with me? I wish to understand, monsieur, what you were doing in the billiard room for 2.5 hours on the evening your uncle died. Playing billiards, as I said. Alone? I prefer my own company. Less chance of losing money." The words were light, but Poirot detected bitterness beneath them. Ah, yes. Money. You have, I think, certain financial difficulties. James's hand froze halfway to his mouth. "Who told you that?" "No one told me, but I observe. Your clothes are excellent but not new. Your shoes have been resoled, though the original leather was of the finest quality. You smoke expensive cigarettes but carry them in a cheap case. These things, they tell a story." A flush crept up James's neck. "All right, yes, I owe money. Rather a lot of it, if you must know. Gambling debts, cards mostly. I'm not proud of it. And your uncle knew this?" The flush deepened to scarlet. Of course he knew. Edmund made it his business to know everything about everyone in this house. He held it over me like a sword of Damocles, said if I didn't reform my ways, he'd cut me out of his will entirely. A powerful motive, Poirot observed gently, for wishing Sir Edmund dead. James stubbed out his cigarette with savage force. "I suppose it is. But I didn't kill him. I couldn't have. That damned locked room proves it. Does it? Or does it merely prove that you are clever?" James laughed, a bitter sound. "If I were clever, Monsieur Poirot, I wouldn't be £50,000 in debt to men who break fingers for late payment. I'm not clever, I'm desperate, but I'm not a murderer." When he had gone, Poirot sat for a moment in thought. Desperate men did desperate things, but did desperation extend to murder? And more to the point, did desperation explain the locked room? Lady Celia came next. She entered pale and composed, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of prayer. "You knew, madame, that your husband intended to change his will." It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes. He told me so at dinner. Not the details, but the intention. And this did not alarm you?" Her laugh was soft and terrible. Everything about Edmund alarmed me, Monsieur Poirot. He was not a kind husband. Poirot let the silence stretch. Then, very gently, "He knew something about your past, something you wish to keep hidden." She went white as chalk. "How did you—" "I am detective, madame. It is my business to know such things. Your first husband, he did not die of natural causes, I think. The story came out in fragments like broken glass being swept into a pile. Her first husband, Gerald, had been a violent man, a drinker. One night, during a particularly vicious argument, he had struck her. She had pushed him away. He had fallen backward down the stairs and broken his neck. The inquest had ruled it accidental death. She had been cleared of all blame. But Edmund discovered it somehow, she whispered. I don't know how. Some investigation. Some old servant who remembered. He confronted me 6 months ago. Said he knew what I'd done, that I'd murdered Gerald and gotten away with it. And had you murdered him? She looked up, her eyes full of tears. I don't know. I pushed him, yes. But I didn't mean for him to die. I just wanted him to stop hitting me. Does that make me a murderer? Poirot did not answer the question. Instead he asked, and Sir Edmund used this knowledge how? He held it over me. Said if I didn't behave exactly as he wished, if I didn't play the perfect wife, he would go to the police. Would ruin me. I would hang, he said. Perhaps I would, perhaps I wouldn't. But the scandal alone would destroy me. Did anyone else know of this? A pause. Then so quietly, Poirot barely heard. Marcus. Dr. Faversham, I told him. I had to tell someone or go mad. And what did Dr. Faversham say when you told him? He said he would help me, that Edmund couldn't be allowed to torture me this way, that something must be done. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. When did you have this conversation with the good doctor? 3 weeks ago. We were walking in the gardens. Edmund was in London on business. Marcus was so kind, so understanding. He said... She stopped. Yes, madame? What did he say? She shook her head. Nothing. Just that he would help. That I wasn't alone. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. You care for Dr. Faversham, I think. More than is perhaps appropriate for a married woman. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I care for kindness, Monsieur Poirot. I care for gentleness. Marcus is everything Edmund was not. But we never... You never acted upon these feelings? Never. I would not. But Edmund suspected anyway. He saw the way Marcus looked at me, the way I looked at him. It was another weapon he used against me. After she left, Poirot sat very still, his fingers steepled before his lips. A wife, trapped in a marriage, blackmailed by a cruel husband. A doctor in love with that wife, determined to protect her. A nephew drowning in debt, dependent on an uncle's will. 3 people, 3 motives. And a locked room that should have made murder impossible. But it had not been impossible. Someone had done it. The question was who, and more importantly, how. Poirot rose and walked to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, covering the grounds in white, covering footprints, covering tracks, covering perhaps the truth. But Hercule Poirot would uncover it. Of that he was certain. He turned from the window and went in search of Mrs. Dorothea Vale, the quiet companion who saw everything and said nothing. She, Poirot suspected, might hold the key to this mystery. If only he could persuade her to turn it. Chapter 6. The Witness Who Feared to Speak. Poirot found Mrs. Dorothea Vale in the conservatory, a cold glass structure where winter had killed all but the hardiest plants. She sat on a wrought iron bench, her hands clasped in her lap, staring at nothing. Madame Vale, may I join you? She started like a rabbit at the sound of a gun. Her eyes, when they met his, held that same quality of fear he had noticed at their first meeting. I suppose you must. He sat beside her, careful to leave distance between them. Sometimes, he had learned, proximity frightened those already afraid. "Oh, you wished to speak with me yesterday evening, before Sir Edmund was found. You said you would find me in the gardens after breakfast." She nodded, her fingers twisting together. "I did. But then everything happened, and I thought perhaps it no longer mattered what I had seen. But it matters very much, I think." "What was it you saw, madame?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I saw Dr. Faversham, the night Sir Edmund died. I saw him in the East Corridor." Poirot's stillness was absolute. "At what time?" She closed her eyes as if to better see the memory. "It was just after 9 o'clock. I had gone down to fetch a book I'd left in the morning room. Miss Beatrice had already retired, and I thought everyone else had as well. But as I passed through the East Corridor, I saw him." "Dr. Faversham?" "Yes. He was coming from the direction of the drawing room. He had his medical bag with him. I thought it odd at the time, but I didn't. I mean, he's a doctor. He often carries his bag. I didn't think—" "What did you think, madame?" "I thought perhaps Sir Edmund had sent for him, that he was feeling unwell. Dr. Faversham has treated him for years. It seemed natural enough." "Did Dr. Faversham see you?" She shook her head. "I was in the shadows near the servants' stair. He passed quite close, but he was preoccupied. He looked—" Her voice faltered. "Yes?" "He looked troubled, grim, as though he had just done something difficult." Poirot allowed the silence to settle, then asked gently, "Why did you not mention this to Inspector Marsh?" "Because I was afraid." Her hands twisted more violently. "Don't you see? If I tell them what I saw, they'll know that Dr. Faversham went into that room. And if he went in and Sir Edmund died, then Dr. Faversham becomes the murderer." Poirot finished softly. Tears tracked down her pale cheeks. "But he's a good man, a kind man. He's treated Miss Beatrice for her nerves, treated the servants when they fall ill, never asks for payment from those who cannot afford it. I cannot believe he would— Yet you are afraid that he did." She looked at him then, and in her eyes Poirot saw the terrible burden of knowledge unwanted. "I am afraid, yes. But more than that, I am afraid of what will happen if I speak. Miss Beatrice depends on him. Lady Celia—" She stopped. "Lady Celia, what?" Mrs. Vale's voice dropped to a whisper. "Lady Celia loves him. Anyone with eyes can see it. And he loves her. If I speak, if I tell what I saw, I destroy them both. I destroy a good man for the sake of a bad one who is already dead. Justice, madame, does not concern itself with whether the dead were good or bad, doesn't it?" She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "Then perhaps it should." After Mrs. Vale had gone, Poirot sat in the cold conservatory and thought. A witness who had seen Dr. Faversham in the East Corridor at 9 o'clock, carrying his medical bag. An hour and a half before Sir Edmund was found locked in his drawing room. If Dr. Faversham had entered the room while it was still unlocked, if he had poisoned the brandy then, he would have had ample time to leave before Sir Edmund locked himself in at 8:30. But no, the timing was wrong. Mrs. Vale had seen Faversham at 9 o'clock, coming from the direction of the drawing room, as Sir Edmund had locked himself in at 8:30. How could Faversham have entered a room that was already locked, unless he had a key? But Miss Beatrice had been adamant that only one key existed. Or unless— Poirot's eyes narrowed. Unless the locked room was not the mystery at all. Unless it was, as he had begun to suspect, a distraction. He rose and went in search of Inspector Marsh. He found him in Sir Edmund's study, going through papers with the methodical determination of a man hoping to find something incriminating. "Inspector, has Sir Edmund's personal journal been found?" "Journal?" Marsh looked up from a ledger of household accounts. Didn't know he kept one. Most men of his temperament do. A record of grievances, usually, of suspicions, of things observed and noted for future use. They searched together and found it within the quarter hour, tucked into a locked drawer of Sir Edmund's desk. The key had been on the ring in his pocket. The journal made for grim reading. Page after page of Sir Edmund's cramped handwriting, detailing his observations of the household, his suspicions about James's debts, his certainty that his wife and Dr. Faversham maintained an inappropriate intimacy, his discovery of Lady Celia's past, and on the final pages, dated 3 days before his death, "I have decided. The will must be changed. Celia will inherit nothing. Neither will James, that worthless wastrel. Beatrice shall have the house and a sufficient income. The remainder goes to charity. Let them all know what it means to betray Edmund Thornfield. I will confront them, both of them, Celia and her doctor. Let them know that I know. Let them understand that their little romance, however chaste they claim it to be, has cost them everything." The final entry was dated the day of Sir Edmund's death. "Tomorrow, I meet with Carruthers to formalise the changes. Tonight, I will inform Celia of her disinheritance, and I will inform Faversham that his visits to this house are no longer welcome. Let them have each other if they dare face society with nothing but love to sustain them. We shall see how long devotion lasts when poverty follows in its wake." Marsh set down the journal. So he was planning to destroy them both. Lady Celia and Dr. Faversham. It would seem so. Poirot picked up the journal and read the entries again. Something about them troubled him, though he could not immediately say what. Then it came to him. The handwriting. In the earlier entries it was controlled, precise. But in the final pages it had begun to deteriorate. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. A slight tremor, a wavering of the lines. "Inspector, look at this." He pointed to the final entry. Marsh squinted at it. "Writing's a bit shaky." "Indeed. And what causes a man's hand to shake? Could be anything. Anger, nerves, age. Or," Poirot said quietly, "the early stages of digitalis poisoning." Marsh's eyes widened. "You think he was already poisoned when he wrote this?" "I think it possible. Digitalis does not kill instantly. It builds in the system. If a dose was administered during the day, the symptoms would begin slowly. Nausea, perhaps, weakness, trembling hands. But a man like Sir Edmund would attribute such things to stress or fatigue. He would not suspect poison. Not until it was too late. So the murderer poisoned him before he locked himself in the drawing room. Precisely. The locked room was never the mystery. It was the alibi. By the time Sir Edmund turned that key, he was already dying. He simply did not know it yet. Marsh sat back, absorbing this. Then who poisoned him? And when? "Ah," Poirot said, his eyes distant. "That, mon ami, is the question we must now answer. But I think, perhaps, we are beginning to see the shape of the truth." He thought of Mrs. Vale's testimony. Dr. Faversham in the corridor at 9 o'clock, medical bag in hand, looking troubled. He thought of Lady Celia's confession. Marcus said he would help me, that something must be done. He thought of the journal's final entry. I will inform Faversham that his visits to this house are no longer welcome. A picture was forming in his mind. Not yet complete, but taking shape. A doctor with medical knowledge and access to poisons. A woman he loved, trapped and blackmailed. An opportunity during the day when the drawing room stood open and the brandy decanter waited, innocent and trusting, and a locked room to make it all seem impossible. Mais oui, Poirot murmured. Yes, I begin to see it now. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Consultation. Dr. Faversham was in Sir Edmund's study when Poirot found him, standing before the window with the stillness of a man awaiting execution. He did not turn when Poirot entered, though he must have heard the footsteps. "You knew I would come," Poirot said quietly. It was not a question, and Faversham did not treat it as one. "Yes, Mrs. Vale spoke to you, I assume. She saw me that evening." "She did. And she has been carrying the burden of that knowledge with considerable anguish." Faversham turned then, and Poirot was struck by the change in him. The urbane physician had vanished, replaced by a man who looked as though he had aged a decade in 2 days. His eyes were hollow, his face grey. "She is a good woman, too good to be forced into such a position. Then perhaps you might relieve her of it by telling me the truth." The doctor moved to Sir Edmund's desk and sat heavily in the chair. His hands, Poirot noted, trembled slightly as they rested on the leather surface. "What would you like to know?" "Let us begin with the evening of Sir Edmund's death. You were seen in the East Corridor at 9 o'clock, carrying your medical bag. Where had you been?" A long pause. Then, "I had been to see Edmund." "In the drawing room?" "The locked drawing room?" "It was not locked when I entered." Faversham's voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching. I knocked. He called for me to enter. We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. "About what did you speak?" Faversham looked up, and in his eyes Poirot saw something that might have been defiance. "He confronted me, said he knew about my feelings for Celia, told me I was no longer welcome in this house, said if I ever approached her again he would destroy us both. Her reputation, my medical practice, everything." "And how did you respond to this?" "I told him he was a cruel, vindictive man who took pleasure in the suffering of others. I told him his wife deserved better than the prison he had made of their marriage. And I left." "At what time?" "Just before 9 o'clock. I heard the clock in the hall strike as I walked away." "And Sir Edmund, he was well when you left him?" Another pause, longer this time. "He was alive, if that's what you're asking. Whether he was well..." He stopped. "Whether he was well, what?" "I thought he looked pale. But Edmund was always pale. I attributed it to anger. He had worked himself into quite a state during our conversation." Poirot moved closer, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. "Tell me, Dr. Faversham, in your medical practice, have you encountered cases of digitalis poisoning?" Faversham's hands stilled. "Of course, any physician has. Digitalis is a common cardiac medication. In proper doses, it strengthens the heart. In excessive amounts, it kills," Poirot finished, "producing symptoms that mimic natural heart failure. Most convenient for anyone wishing to commit murder without detection." The doctor's face hardened. "If you are accusing me..." "I am merely observing, mon ami, that you possess both the knowledge and the means to have poisoned Sir Edmund. You knew his cardiac condition. You knew which poison would appear most natural. You had access to the drawing room before it was locked. And you had, did you not, a powerful motive." "What motive?" Poirot's voice was gentle, almost kind. Love, Doctor. You are in love with Lady Celia. Have been for some time, I think. And Sir Edmund was destroying her piece by piece, day by day, using her past as a weapon to control her. A man in love will do extraordinary things to protect the object of his devotion. Faversham rose abruptly, walking to the window. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Yes, I love her. I have loved her since Edmund first brought her to this house as his bride 3 years ago. I watched him diminish her, watched her become a shadow of the woman she should have been. And when she came to me in tears, told me what he had discovered about her first husband, told me how he was using it to torment her. He turned back to Poirot. You want to know if I killed him? If I took my medical knowledge and used it to end his miserable life? Yes, I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. But wanting and doing are not the same thing, are they not? Poirot tilted his head, studying the doctor as he might study a specimen under glass. Let me present to you a theory, Dr. Faversham. On the day of Sir Edmund's death, you visited this house during the afternoon. You had done so many times before. I am ostensibly to attend to Miss Beatrice. But on this particular day, you went to the drawing room. Perhaps you knew Sir Edmund was out. Perhaps you knew the brandy decanter would be there, waiting. And perhaps you added something to it. Something that would not kill immediately, but would work its way through the system over hours. By the time Sir Edmund locked himself in that room, he was already poisoned. He simply did not know it yet. Faversham's face had gone white. That's logical? Yes, I think so. The locked room becomes irrelevant if the poison was administered before the door was secured. And who better to administer such a poison than a physician with access, knowledge, and motive? You cannot prove this. Can I not? Poirot's voice remained soft, but there was steel beneath the silk. I can prove you were in the house that afternoon. The servants will confirm it. I can prove you have access to digitalis. Your medical bag almost certainly contains it. I can prove your motive through Lady Celia's testimony and Sir Edmund's journal. What I cannot yet prove is that you actually committed the act. But I will, Dr. Faversham. Of that, you may be certain. The doctor sank back into the chair. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, so quietly, Poirot barely heard it. She knew nothing about it. I beg your pardon? Celia, Lady Celia. Whatever you think, whatever you believe, she knew nothing. She never asked me to do it, never suggested it. The decision was mine alone. Poirot considered this. Was it? Or did she plant the seed, knowing how you felt, knowing what you were capable of? A woman tells a man who loves her that she is being destroyed by her husband. She does not need to ask for help. The asking is implicit in the telling. Number. Faversham's voice was fierce. No, you don't understand. She is innocent in this. Completely innocent. But Poirot shook his head. In his long career he had learned that innocence and guilt were rarely so simple. Lady Celia might not have wielded the poison, might not even have spoken the words. But had she known? Had some part of her understood what she was setting in motion when she confided in Dr. Faversham? Inspector Marsh must be told, Poirot said gently. You understand this? Faversham nodded slowly. Yes, I understand. Will you confess? The doctor looked up, and in his eyes Poirot saw resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. I will tell the truth. Whether that constitutes confession, I leave to the law to decide. As Poirot turned to leave, Faversham spoke again. Monsieur Poirot, one question, We? When did you know? When did you first suspect? Poirot paused at the door. When I smelled the brandy glass and found it contained more than brandy. When I saw the locked room and realized it was meant to deceive. But most of all, Doctor, when I saw the way you looked at Lady Celia. Love, it is a powerful force. It can create beauty, but it can also create monsters. Sometimes they are the same thing. He left Dr. Faversham sitting in Sir Edmund's chair, a man who had tried to save the woman he loved and had instead destroyed them both. Chapter 8. The Drawing Room Speaks. Inspector Marsh assembled the household in the drawing room at Poirot's request. The company gathered with evident reluctance, none wishing to occupy the space where Sir Edmund had died. Yet Poirot had been insistent. The room itself, he had told Marsh, was part of the solution. To understand the crime, one must stand where it occurred. They arranged themselves with the unconscious choreography of guilt and innocence. Miss Beatrice took the chair farthest from where her brother's body had been found, her spine rigid as iron. James Ashworth stood near the door as though contemplating escape. Mrs. Vale hovered by the bookcase, nearly invisible in her grey dress. Lady Celia sat by the window, her face turned towards the gardens, and Dr. Faversham stood alone before the cold fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. Inspector Marsh positioned himself near the desk. Poirot took the centre of the room. "You have asked us here to make an arrest, I presume," Miss Beatrice said. Her voice was brittle as old glass. "I trust you will not keep us in suspense." "Patience, madame. First we must understand what happened. Only then can we speak of arrests." Poirot began to pace, his steps measured and precise. He gestured to the room as he spoke. 3 days ago, Sir Edmund Thornfield locked himself in this room and died. The door was secured from within, the windows latched. No possible entrance or exit. A locked room mystery, as the detective stories call it. But I have learned, mes amis, that the most complicated mysteries often have the simplest solutions. He paused before James Ashworth. "You, Monsieur James, owed a great deal of money, £50,000 to be exact. Your uncle knew this. He held it over you. I threatened to disinherit you. With Sir Edmund dead, you stood to inherit Thornfield Manor and be free of your debts. A powerful motive for murder." James's face flushed. "I've already told you, please let me finish. You also had opportunity. You claim you were alone in the billiard room from 8:30 until 11 o'clock. No one saw you there. You could have entered this room during the day, poisoned the brandy, and waited for your uncle to drink it." "Then why didn't I?" James demanded. "Because," Poirot said gently, "you are not clever enough for such a crime. Your sins are the sins of weakness, not calculation. You gamble, you lose, you borrow more. This is impulse, not planning. And this murder required planning of a most meticulous kind." He moved on before James could respond. "Miss Beatrice, you have lived in this house your entire life. Your brother was your only family. And yet there was no love between you, was there? He treated you as a dependent, a burden. You must have resented that." Miss Beatrice's eyes were cold. Resentment is not murder. No. But resentment combined with opportunity might be. You knew Sir Edmund's habits intimately. You had access to this room at all times, and you would inherit the house upon his death. Perhaps you grew tired of waiting. Beatrice stood, her face white with fury. "How dare you?" But Poirot raised a hand. "Please, madame, I do not accuse. I merely examine possibilities. And the possibility exists that you might have done this terrible thing." He let the words hang for a moment, then continued. However, I do not believe you did. You are a woman of rigid principle, Miss Beatrice. You might wish your brother dead, might even believe the world better without him, but you would not lower yourself to poison. It is beneath you. Beatrice sat slowly, her anger displaced by something that might have been relief. Poirot turned to Mrs. Vale. And you, madame, the quiet companion who sees everything and says nothing. You witnessed the cruelties of this household. You saw how Sir Edmund treated his wife. You knew, I think, about Dr. Faversham's feelings for Lady Celia. You might have acted to spare them both. Mrs. Vale's voice was barely audible. I would never— No, Poirot agreed. You would not. You are too frightened, too uncertain of your place in this world. Murder requires a kind of terrible conviction that you do not possess. He moved to stand before the fireplace, beside Dr. Faversham. Which brings us to you, Doctor. You have already admitted to me that you were in this room the evening Sir Edmund died, that you argued with him, that you left shortly before 9 o'clock. The others stirred at this revelation. You also had access to digitalis, Poirot continued. You possess the medical knowledge to administer it in a dose that would kill while mimicking heart failure. You loved Lady Celia and wished to free her from her torment. And you knew that Sir Edmund planned to destroy you both, to leave her penniless and you professionally ruined. Dr. Faversham stood motionless, his face carved from stone. Tell them, Poirot said softly. Tell them what you told me. A long silence. Then Faversham spoke, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I came to this house on the afternoon of the 21st. I told the servants I was here to check on Miss Beatrice's prescription, but that was a lie. I came to the drawing room when I knew Edmund would be out. I brought with me a vial of digitalis, and I added it to the brandy decanter. Lady Celia made a sound, quickly stifled. Miss Beatrice gripped the arms of her chair. I knew Edmund's habits, Faversham continued. I knew he would pour himself a brandy that evening when he worked late. I knew the poison would take several hours to work, that by the time he locked himself in this room, death would already be growing in his veins. The locked door was never the mystery. It was my alibi. Everyone would assume the killer had to be inside the room with him, or had to have some impossible means of entering and leaving. No one would think to look earlier in the day. Inspector Marsh stepped forward. Marcus Faversham, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Edmund Thornfield. But Poirot held up a hand. A moment, Inspector. There is more to this story than a simple confession. He turned to Lady Celia, who had not moved from her place by the window. Madame, you knew, did you not? When you told Dr. Faversham of your troubles, when you confided in him about your husband's blackmail, you knew what he would do. Her voice was a whisper. I didn't ask him to. No, you did not ask. That is the terrible cleverness of it. You simply told him you were trapped, that Edmund was destroying you, that you saw no way out. And you told this to a man who loved you, a man with the means and knowledge to solve your problem. You did not need to ask. The request was implicit in the telling. She turned to face him then, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know. I didn't think— Did you not? Poirot's voice was gentle but inexorable. Or did you simply tell yourself you did not know? It is a very convenient blindness, madame. Dr. Faversham moved toward her. Stop. You're twisting everything. Celia is innocent. This was my decision, my action, my crime. Was it? Poirot looked between them. Or was it a crime born of complicity? You poisoned the brandy, Doctor, but she gave you the reason and the opportunity. She planted the seed, even if she did not tend the garden. Lady Celia sank into her chair, her face in her hands. Mrs. Vale moved to comfort her, but Poirot shook his head. No, let her face what she has done, or what she has allowed to be done. The distinction, I think, is smaller than either of them would like to believe. Inspector Marsh cleared his throat. So we have our murderer. Dr. Faversham administered the poison, and Lady Celia, Poirot said quietly, provided the motive and the moral permission. Whether that makes her guilty in law, I leave to you, but in the eyes of God and conscience, she is as culpable as the man who held the vial. The drawing-room fell silent. Outside, the December afternoon was drawing to a close. Inside, the truth had finally been spoken, and in that truth, no one was innocent. Chapter 9. The Full Confession. The silence that followed Poirot's pronouncement stretched like wire pulled taut. Then Dr. Faversham spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man who has set down a burden too long carried. You want the full truth, Monsieur Poirot? Very well, you shall have it. He moved away from the fireplace. I'm standing instead where Sir Edmund's body had been found. The gesture was deliberate, almost ritualistic. For 20 years I attended this family. I watched Edmund's first wife die of consumption. Watched him remarry within a year with no more emotion than a man replacing a broken piece of china. I watched him treat Celia with cold civility that masked his contempt. And I held my tongue because that is what one does. One maintains professional distance. One does not interfere. His hands clenched at his sides. But 3 weeks ago, Celia came to me in the gardens. Edmund was in London. She was distraught, barely coherent. She told me everything. About her first husband's death, about how Edmund had discovered it, about the threats he made daily. That he would see her hang if she displeased him, that he would expose her past and watch her be destroyed. Lady Celia sat motionless, her face streaked with tears. And what did you say to her? Poirot asked quietly. Faversham's voice was hoarse. I said what any man would say to a woman he loves in torment. I said I would help her, that Edmund could not be allowed to torture her this way, that something must be done. Those exact words. Something must be done? Yes, those exact words. He looked at Celia. I saw relief in her eyes when I said it. Relief and something else. Hope, perhaps, or permission. He turned back to Poirot. She left me then, thanked me and walked back to the house. And I stood in the garden and understood what I had committed myself to doing. You could have chosen another path, Miss Beatrice said, her voice cutting. You could have gone to the authorities, unexposed Edmund's blackmail. The law does not look kindly upon such things. The law, Faversham replied bitterly, would have required proof. Edmund was too clever for that. His threats were always verbal, always private. It would have been Celia's word against his. And who would believe a woman with a dead husband in her past over a respected gentleman? No, Miss Beatrice. The law was no refuge. So you chose murder, Inspector Marsh said flatly. I chose to end Edmund's capacity to harm. Whether that constitutes murder or liberation, I leave to others to decide. James Ashworth spoke from his position by the door. But why? Why risk everything for a woman you could never have? She was married, for God's sake. Because, Faversham said simply, she deserved better than the life she had. And because I could not stand by and watch Edmund destroy her piece by piece. You call it murder. I call it necessary intervention. Poirot stepped forward. Tell us the method. Precisely how did you do it? Faversham drew a breath, steadying himself. On the afternoon of the 21st, I came to Thornfield under the pretext of checking Miss Beatrice's prescription. I brought with me a vial of digitalis from my surgery, concentrated, far beyond any therapeutic dose. I waited until the servants were occupied, then entered this room. The brandy decanter stood on the sideboard, as it always did. I added the digitalis to it, not a large amount in volume, but sufficient in potency. Then I left. How did you know Sir Edmund would drink from that particular decanter? Because I knew his habits as well as I knew my own. When every evening he worked late, he poured himself a brandy from this room. It was ritual, unvarying. I knew he would drink it that night or the next. I simply had to wait. And the locked room? Poirot gestured to the door. That was intended to mislead? Precisely. I knew that when Edmund died in a locked room, suspicion would focus on the impossibility of the crime. Everyone would ask how someone could have entered and left. No one would think to look at what happened before the door was locked. The locked room was my masterpiece of misdirection. Mrs. Vale's voice was shaking. But you came back that evening. I saw you in the corridor at 9 o'clock. Yes. Faversham's face darkened. I could not stay away. I had to know if it had worked. I knocked on the drawing-room door. Edmund was alive, but barely. He let me in. He was already experiencing symptoms, though he attributed them to indigestion. We argued. He told me to leave and never return. I went, knowing that within hours he would be dead. And you felt no remorse? Miss Beatrice demanded. Remorse? He looked at her. I felt relief. I felt satisfaction that a cruel man would torture no one else. And yes, I felt guilt. Not for ending Edmund's life, but for the necessity of doing so. For living in a world where such actions become needful. Poirot turned to Lady Celia. And you, madame? When did you know what Dr. Faversham had done? She raised her head, her eyes red but clear. I knew that afternoon, the afternoon of the 21st. I saw Marcus arrive, saw him leave. And I knew. I didn't ask, I didn't confirm, but I knew. Why did you not stop him? Her voice broke. Because I wanted to be free. Ah, God help me, I wanted Edmund dead. I told myself I didn't know for certain, that perhaps Marcus was simply visiting the house on legitimate business. But that was a lie I told myself to avoid facing the truth. Which was that I had asked him to do this. Not in words, perhaps, but when I confided in him, when I told him of my suffering and looked at him with desperation in my eyes, I was asking. And when he said something must be done and I felt relief, I gave my answer. She stood facing them all. Marcus says I am innocent, but I am not. I knew what he was capable of. I knew what my confession would provoke in a man who loved me, and I did nothing to prevent it. I let him sacrifice himself for me. Faversham moved toward her. No. Celia, no, this is my crime alone, is it? She looked at him with infinite sadness. You held the poison, but I pointed you towards the victim. We are both guilty, Marcus. You of the act, and I of the desire behind it. Poirot nodded slowly. Voilà. Now we have the truth. Dr. Faversham administered the poison. Lady Celia knew it would be done and did not prevent it. Together they conspired to murder Sir Edmund Thornfield. Inspector Marsh stepped forward, resignation on his weathered face. Marcus Faversham, Celia Thornfield I am arresting you both for the murder of Sir Edmund Thornfield." As the handcuffs were produced, Faversham spoke once more. "Monsieur Poirot, you said earlier that love can create monsters. You were wrong. Edmund was the monster. Love simply gave us the courage to stop him." Poirot's expression was unreadable. "Perhaps, Doctor. But the law does not distinguish between monsters slain in self-defense and monsters removed for convenience. You chose murder over other options. You must face the consequences of that choice." The arrested pair were led away. Lady Celia walked with her head high, Dr. Faversham beside her. Whatever else they were, they faced their fate together. When they had gone, Miss Beatrice rose stiffly. "My brother was not an easy man to love, Monsieur Poirot, but he was my brother, and now I am alone." She left without another word. Poirot stood in the drawing-room as the others dispersed. The locked room had yielded its secret. The impossible crime had been explained, and yet he felt no satisfaction, only a profound weariness. Murder was never simple, never clean. Even when the victim deserved his fate, even when the motive was love, and the act itself corrupted all it touched. He walked to the window and looked out at the December dusk. Snow had begun to fall again, covering everything in white, covering the footprints of the guilty and the innocent alike. Chapter 10. Order Restored. The trial took place in April, when the grounds of Thornfield Manor had begun to show the first tentative signs of spring. Poirot did not attend. He had given his testimony to the prosecution and had no desire to watch the inevitable conclusion play itself out in court. Inspector Marsh visited him in London on the day the verdict was announced. "Guilty on both counts," the inspector said, settling into the chair Poirot offered him. Dr. Faversham pleaded guilty to murder. Made quite a speech about it, actually. Said Lady Celia bore no legal responsibility, odd that she had never asked him to kill her husband, never knew of his plan. The prosecution argued conspiracy, but the jury couldn't quite agree on her level of involvement. And the sentence? Faversham got life imprisonment. He'll die in prison, no doubt. Lady Celia received 7 years. The judge took into account the blackmail, the duress she'd been under. Said her culpability was diminished by the circumstances. Poirot nodded slowly. 7 years. It seemed both too much and too little for the complex guilt she carried. Faversham asked that I thank you, Marsh continued. Said you were the only one who truly understood what happened, that you saw the whole truth, not just the convenient parts. The whole truth, Poirot murmured, is rarely convenient and rarely satisfying. He poured tea with careful precision, of the ritual soothing in its orderliness. What of the others? The household? Marsh accepted the cup. Miss Beatrice took it hard. Her brother might have been a difficult man, but he was all she had. She's left Thornfield, taken rooms in Bath. Lives alone, won't see anyone. And the young Monsieur Ashworth inherited everything. The house, the estate, enough money to pay his debts twice over. But he couldn't stay there. Said the drawing-room haunted him. Sold the whole property within a year and moved to London. I hear he's reformed somewhat. Stopped gambling. Whether that lasts, who can say? Money and guilt make strange companions, Poirot observed. Mrs. Vale remained with Miss Beatrice, Marsh said. Feels responsible somehow. Thinks if she'd spoken up sooner about seeing Faversham that night, she might have prevented the whole tragedy. I told her she couldn't have known what it meant, but guilt doesn't listen to logic. No, Poirot agreed. Guilt is its own locked room, from which there is no easy escape. The inspector set down his cup. You know what struck me about this case? We were all so focused on that locked door. How did someone get in? How did they get out? We couldn't see past it. But you saw immediately that the locked room wasn't the mystery at all. It was the alibi, Poirot said. The locked room made us think the murder had to occur while Sir Edmund was inside, alone and inaccessible. We forgot to look at the hours before. The poison was already in his veins when he turned that key. The door locked him in with his own death, but death had entered much earlier. Clever, Marsh admitted. Diabolically clever, but not clever enough. Murder, Inspector. It is never clever enough. It creates more problems than it solves. Dr. Faversham sought to free Lady Celia from her prison, but succeeded only in creating a new one for them both. After Marsh departed, Poirot sat for a long time by his window, watching London's ceaseless movement below. He thought of Thornfield Manor, empty now, its rooms silent. He thought of Dr. Faversham in his cell, paying for a crime born of love and desperation. He thought of Lady Celia, who had planted the seed of murder without speaking the words, and must now live with the harvest. He thought of Sir Edmund Thornfield, who had used knowledge as a weapon and control as armour, and had died alone in a locked room of his own making. The human heart, Poirot reflected, is the greatest locked room of all. We lock away our desires, our desperation, our capacity for both love and cruelty. And sometimes when the key turns, what emerges destroys us. He rose and adjusted a picture frame that hung on his wall. It had been crooked by perhaps 2 degrees. Now it was straight. Order restored. But some disorders, he knew, could never be corrected. Some rooms, once locked, remained closed forever. 3 months later, Poirot received a letter from Lady Celia. It was brief, written on prison stationery in a hand that remained elegant despite her circumstances. "Dear Monsieur Poirot," she wrote, "Dr. Faversham tells me I should hate you for exposing the truth, but I find I cannot. You saw what we were too frightened to acknowledge ourselves, that we were both guilty, that we had both chosen this path however much we told ourselves otherwise, and there is a strange relief in being forced to face the truth, however terrible. I thank you for that, if for nothing else." She signed it simply, Celia. Poirot folded the letter with care and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he locked the drawer and pocketed the key. At Thornfield Manor, the new estate agent walked through the empty rooms, making notes for potential buyers. The house was sound, the grounds extensive. It would sell given time and the right buyer. Someone who did not know its history or who did not care. He paused in the drawing room. It had been cleaned, repaired, restored to order. The door closed smoothly now, its lock replaced. The windows gleamed in the spring sunlight. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the desk where Sir Edmund's unfinished letter had lain. The agent made his notes and moved on. Just another room in just another house. But in the silence after his footsteps faded, the room remembered. The chair where a man had died. The place where the brandy decanter had stood, innocent and deadly. The door that had locked a dying man inside with a mystery that was no mystery at all. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking time that no longer mattered to Sir Edmund Thornfield. Outside, the gardens bloomed in ignorance of what had occurred within these walls. Life continued as it always did, indifferent to human tragedy. In London, Hercule Poirot prepared for bed with his customary precision, clothes folded just so, shoes aligned perfectly, everything in its place, everything ordered. But as he turned out the light, he thought of the locked drawing room, of the poison administered in secret, of the love that became murder, of the guilt shared between two people who had destroyed themselves in destroying another. Order could be restored to a room, to a house, to a life. But some acts created a disorder that would never be corrected. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He closed his eyes and let sleep come. In Thornfield Manor, the drawing room stood silent. The door was closed. The lock was turned. And in the darkness, the mystery that was never a mystery at all settled like dust over everything, waiting to be forgotten. But Hercule Poirot would remember. He always remembered. The cases, the criminals, the victims, the locked rooms and the keys that opened them, because that was what he did. That was who he was. And in remembering, he bore witness to the truth that others wished to forget. The locked drawing room, the impossible crime, the simplest solution. Love and murder, intertwined like poison in brandy, bitter and sweet at once. Order restored, but innocence lost forever.